In this video, I'm going to teach you guys how to play Enigmatic Fires in the MTG Arena Explorer format. Explorer is a Magic the Gathering Arena specific format. You can play with cards all the way back from the original Ixalan, so it has a pretty big card pool. The ban list is pretty much the same as the Pioneer ban list, except the only addition is Tybalt's Trickery. I actually just started playing this format only about a week or so ago, but I've already gone all the way from Bronze up to Diamond just by playing this deck specifically. So I want to explain to you guys a little bit more about this deck, why I'm playing it, what I like about it, don't like about it, and how to get better at it if you want to pick it up for the first time. Enigmatic Fires gets its name after this card, Enigmatic Incarnation. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice another enchantment. If you do, search your library for a creature card with mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrificed enchantment's mana value, then put that card directly onto the battlefield and then shuffle. If you like decks that are toolbox decks that have a lot of one-up tutors, decks that have a lot of good grinding power, this is kind of the deck for you. If you like playing with all 5 colors in your deck, you can do that with this deck. It has a very flexible play style and has a lot of tools to deal with a lot of different things in the meta. The couple weaknesses of this deck is that A, it can't really kill an opponent quickly. There's no real super aggressive plan that you can take. It's very hard to disrupt, even with counter magic, hand hate, traditional removal, etc., because a lot of your things generate advantage as soon as you play them, and there's a lot of live top decks with the deck. There's a lot of things that if you draw them, you're always happy to draw them because they either are a threat, or they draw you into a threat, or they accrue value with another piece of your deck, so on and so forth. If you want to find the stock version of this list, you can find it in the description of this video below. I'll link to the MTG Goldfish version of this page and just taking a peek at what it looks like it has in it. We're going to go into the different options for creatures and stuff too. The first thing to point out about this deck, it is a Yorion deck. So we do have an 80 card deck, which actually gives us room for a lot more one of kind of tutor targets. So you have a lot of opportunities to play more flex slots in your board. We play a good amount of lands, and Yorion also does take up a card in our sideboard slot. We don't play anything at 1 mana, interestingly, because there really aren't any good enchantments at 1 mana to play, and any creature you play at 1 mana isn't actually tutorable with Enigmatic Carnation. What you have to remember is there is a somewhat virtual deck building restriction in this deck because you're playing Enigmatic Incarnation. You want a lot of your cards to either be a sacrifice outlet for the enigmatic, so you either want it to be an enchantment that can be sacrificed, or you oftentimes want it to be a creature that you can get with the enigmatic incarnation. Therefore, for every enchantment you play in the deck, you always want there to be a creature target that you can get with it. There just happen to be no good enchantments at the 1 mana slot really in Explorer. When you're playing in Pioneer, you actually get Chained to the Rocks, which is a really, really strong kind of Path to Exile effect that you don't get in this format. Some people will choose to play Portable Hole as their 1 mana form of interaction, but the issue with this is obviously it's an artifact, so it's not sacrifice fodder for Enigmatic Incarnation, so you can't transmute it into 2 mana creatures. Likewise, because there are no 1 mana artifacts, you don't really see other 2 mana creatures besides Spirited Companion. Spirited Companion is a 2 mana creature that is also an enchantment, so you can play it, you get value out of it, and then you can later sacrifice it to get something else. You'll see a similar theme for all of these enchantments. All these enchantments, when they enter the battlefield, they give you some sort of value right away. Spirited Companion draws a card. Omen of the Sea draws a card. Trial of Ambition is removal. Urban Utopia draws a card and fixes your mana. These cards are particularly strong because they give you the card back right away, and they linger, and they will, by the 4th or 5th turn, generate additional value with either Enigmatic Incarnation and Yorion the Sky Nomad. And the opponent isn't really incentivized to blow up these things at 2 mana because they've already given you value, so they don't want to waste cards to kind of to tear apart at these enchantments that have already given you something. Anyways, because you have a lot of enchantments at 2 mana, you wind up having a lot of good creature targets at 3 mana. The one that I am typically getting the most often is Renegade Rallier. Now, again, remember what Enigmatic Carnation does. Enigmatic Carnation is you may sack another enchantment. If you do, search your library for a creature with CVC 1 plus the sacrificed enchantment's mana value. Renegade Rallier is the one that I find myself getting the most often. You oftentimes will get if you don't need to deal with something your opponent has in play. So Renegade Rallier is an engine in itself. When you sacrifice something like an Omen or an Urban Utopia or a Spirited Companion, you can actually fetch Renegade Rallier, which can then bring back that Omen or Urban Utopia or Spirited Companion and just draw you a card. So you're sacrificing an enchantment that already replaced itself to draw another card with it, and you also get a 3/2 body. So Renegade Rallier is this value engine card that you play that's always just a good freebie to get if you don't need to search up a specific tutor target for a certain situation. The reason I play 2 of them is because I find Renegade Rallier is one of the things I'm getting the most commonly, and I like having multiple of them. You do technically have Glasspool Mimic as another copy of Renegade Rallier as well, but I like actually having even 3 copies of Rallier. I find they're really, really strong. I can also shave a copy of Renegade Rallier, which I do sometimes in certain sideboard matchups where I don't need the extra grinding power. A lot of these other ones are situationally based. So for example, Knight of Autumn is very good against artifacts and enchantments. It also can be useful against aggressive decks for gaining life and putting a body into play. You have some other type of permanent removal. So you have both Deputy of Detention and Skyclave Apparition. Just to be clear, these are useful in different situations. Deputy of Detention can target any non-land permanent. However, when Deputy leaves, they get the non-land permanent back. So this has a broader application, but it has a worse drawback when it dies. Skyclave Apparition can exile non-land, non-token permanents, but only if their mana value is 4 or less. But when Skyclave Apparition leaves, instead of returning the permanent to them, they get an XX blue illusion where X is equal to the converted mana value of that exiled card. So the drawback of Skyclave leaving isn't as bad as the drawback of Deputy of Detention leaving. So you actually often want to get Skyclave if it's an option, and you get Deputy when you find yourself dealing with a threat that Skyclave can't deal with. So Skyclave can't deal with common things such as a Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. It can't deal with opposing Titan of Industries. Really anything that's 5 mana or more if your opponent has a giant token. Deputy Detention is actually really, really sweet at dealing with tokens because they don't get the tokens back when Deputy leaves. If you have something to bounce it with, like Yorion, you can just keep poofing their tokens away. So it's good to deal with treasure tokens, blood tokens, tokens from Fable the Mirror Breaker. It also deals with tokens from Wandering Emperor and all sorts of stuff like that. So Deputy Detention is kind of an all-star in the deck. Deputy and Skyclave you get very frequently. Callous Bloodmage can act similar to a Renegade Rallier, where it can draw you a card, but it also has other versatility where you can make a 1/1. So this is the only creature you can tutor that can make 2 bodies if you need 2 blockers. It can also exile someone's graveyard, which winds up being relevant against matchups such as the Greasefang matchup, when you want to get rid of their Parhelion in their graveyard. Moonblessed Cleric is nice when you need a specific enchantment. So if you're looking specific, if let's say you have an Enigmatic and you can tutor up, if you need a Leyline Binding to deal with something, it's a really good tutor target for Leyline Binding. Oftentimes the best thing you can do in this deck is you have Enigmatic Incarnation. If you had played a Leyline Binding on like turns 2 or 3, and you sacrifice it on turn 4 with Enigmatic, you can get either Agent of Treachery or Titan of Industry, or you can also get Coma out of the sideboard if you're playing sideboard games, but you get a 7. You can easily convert your Leyline Binding into a 7-drop. Moonblessed Cleric can also get you a Fires of Invention if you want to like do a lot more with if you're choked on, if you just want more mana. Fable is always a really good card to get. If you want another Enigmatic, there's like, you could just tutor whatever you need. If all the good stuff is in your graveyard, you can tutor up Gloomshrieker. By the way, Gloomshrieker is an awesome target to get. And also Gloomshrieker is nice because it's an enchantment creature. We're only playing, I think, like 3 enchantment creatures in the deck. And enchantment creatures are super valuable in this deck because they can both be tutored up and they can be sacrificed as fodder to get something. So Spirited Companion can be sacrificed. Gloom Shredder can be tutored and sacrificed. And so can Thassa Deep Dwelling, which is one of the reasons why I'm playing it. Most people don't play this card. We'll get to that in a second. Some other things you're seeing at the 3 mana slot include Oath of Kaya, just another removal spell that can be sacrificed for a 4 mana object. Glasspool Mimic, which is nice because it can be a land, but it can also be a copy of whatever your best creature currently in play is. I will often find myself copying a Skyclave or Deputy if I need extra removal. You can copy Knight of Autumn, you can copy Renegade Rallier, you can copy your own Yorion and just sack it so you get the bounce effect again. Copying legendaries is totally fine. Having a second Siege Rhino. You can copy Titan or Agent of Treachery. Glasspool is so flexible. It's so awesome. It's kind of like the Vesuva. If you play Modern and you play Amulet Titan, it's kind of like the Vesuva of the Enigmatic Fires deck. It can just basically be whatever your best creature in play currently is. And you also get the Enter the Battlefield effect of that creature also. And then the last card at 3 is Fable, which potentially is one of the best 3 drops in our deck. Fable is just a very unassuming looking card, but it's one of the defining cards of this format. And honestly, a lot of formats right now. Fable is kind of dominated a lot of formats since its printing. Fable makes you a dork that gives you treasure. So even if you have to, even sacrificing the dork to make a treasure, if you're attacking into a bigger creature, is oftentimes worth it to get extra mana ramp. The discard effect is super relevant because you can either filter 4 lands or filter your lands into more relevant spells. And then Reflection of Kiki-Jiki works with every single creature in your deck. Everything has entered the battlefield effect. If you get to use Reflection of Kiki-Jiki even once, you get so much value off it. It is unbelievable. You're just copying a Siege Rhino and you're lightning helixing your opponent and attacking with a 4/5. Like, that's really, really, really strong. You could copy Yorion to get the blink effect again. Copying a 7-drop is insane, and all your 3-drops generate value. So Kiki-Jiki Fable is really, really, really powerful in this deck, and a really important card to be playing, and it's always feels good to have to play Fable on turn 3. When you get to the 4-drops, you're going to see 4 of them in this deck. There's other 3-drops that people do play in this deck that I'm not currently playing. I mean, you could play Raiding God of the Worthy, which is good against like more control-based decks. I haven't felt like I've needed this card ever. It prevents your opponent from makes it harder for them to cast larger spells. It can help with stuff like Farewell. It can help in the mirror match because your opponent, it's harder for them to cast their fires or their enigmatic carnations. This card is an interesting inclusion you could consider trying. I haven't tried this card yet, but you could play with it. And you could play things like Zur in the deck. You can play Archon, which I haven't felt like was that good when I played it. I played this card for a little bit. I didn't really like it that much. At 4 mana, obviously you have 4 copies of Enigmatic Carnation. This card is the keystone card of the deck. It kind of is the glue that holds the deck together and makes the deck function. If you can land one of these, you're pretty much always going to be in a very strong position and very favored to win. If you can stick this and your opponent can't deal with it, you're going to just accrue so much value, and you're going to be able to stabilize in such a way where it could be after like two turns of using this, it'll be impossible for your opponent to recover in a lot of situations. Fires allows you to basically triple your mana every turn because you get your 2 spells, and then you can actually use your lands for a lot of things in your deck. And you can use your lands to, say, cycle your cycling lands to get redraws for more spells. You can use your lands to put Yorion in your hand, or to sacrifice an Omen of the Sea. Or to activate Scarab God. You can do a lot of stuff with your mana in this deck, even when you're under a fires. It's like sometimes you need your mana to cast Leyline Binding because of how Leyline Binding interacts with fires. You need to have enough lands to cast Leyline Binding. Otherwise, you need to pay the mana. Under fires, you need 6 lands to cast Leyline Binding. If you don't have 6 lands, you just got to pay whatever the cost of binding would be if you didn't have fires in play. Unlike some other fires decks, though, this deck doesn't need fires, as I mentioned, to run. When you're playing against decks like the Cavalier decks, a lot of them still work, but they don't work nearly as effectively without fires, as I mentioned. It's like an important card for the deck to draw. This deck does not rely on fires to be strong. It makes it even stronger. Siege Rhino is a card you're going to be tutoring for very frequently, especially because there's a lot of aggressive decks in this format. A lot of Gruul aggro decks. There's a lot of black or Jund like kind of aggressive decks. There's mono blue aggro. There's a lot of like different burn. There's a lot of aggressive red decks. There's a lot of like low to the ground, like white weenies, a lot of low to the ground aggressive decks in this format. The other card most people are playing is Serra's Paragon. Some people will play like Archon of Sun's Grace or something like that. You can experiment with what you want for this 4th slot. I think Serra Paragon is the most common. And Serra Paragon is an insanely awesome card. This is actually one of my favorite cards from this set. I like this card a lot. The only issue with this card is you don't always get immediate value when you play it normally. What I like about Thassa, let's say I just draw a Thassa and a Serra in my hand. I want to play one on turn 4. When I play Thassa on turn 4, I feel like I get at least 1 blink off of the Thassa, which is super nice. I like the immediate value that you get when you just draw it naturally and play it. When you tutor for it, you have to wait another full turn before you get it. But you have to wait another full turn for Serra Paragon to get her effect too, if you tutor for her. So either way, you have to wait a turn for them. And Serra Paragon is more easily dealt with. You can just removal spell, kill it. Like it just dies to Fatal Push. This doesn't. This is indestructible. It's also not really a creature. It doesn't die to like Supreme Verdict and stuff like that, which is nice. So this sticks around better. There's just a lot of... I think Serra Paragon is better when it sticks and when you get to use it over and over again. Like if it actually works, I think Serra Paragon is better. But the fact that Thassa is more resilient to hate, and you can get value immediately when you normal cast it, whereas Serra Paragon you sometimes don't. You will if you cast it later in the game, but not in the same way that Thassa does earlier in the game. For me, I've enjoyed playing with Thassa. I like the tap effect. It's another thing you can do under Fires of Invention to spend your mana. You can tap their creatures. It's really useful against aggressive decks or against decks that have like one giant thing you just want to tap down every turn. It's also an enchantment, so you can sacrifice it for one of your 5-drops. So you cannot fetch Serra and then sack it to something else, but you can fetch up Thassa Deep Dwelling, and then you can sacrifice Thassa Deep Dwelling to get Yorion, Scarab God, or Tolsimir, which is really, really convenient. So you can fetch out Thassa, and then at the end step of the next turn, you get a Thassa Blink, and you can sacrifice Thassa. So you get a blink off of it, and you can get another creature off it. So it's really useful. It's really, really nice. 5-drops, you have another copy of Yorion. Yorion is amazing. If you don't have to worry about interacting with your opponent and stuff, and you have a big board state, you can just get Yorion, which is really nice because it blinks all your stuff and you just get value the same way your companion is valuable. It's good to have one of to tutor in your deck. Also, sometimes you wind up drawing this card a lot, which is sweet too. And just playing Yorion is just really, really strong. This card is so busted. I mean, why is this still legal? They're going to have to ban this card at some point in this format. Scarab God and Tolsimir are useful in different situations. Tolsimir is good against the aggressive decks. Tolsimir is really strong because it makes 2 bodies and it eats an enemy creature. So it's really, really good against those low to the ground decks. It's good against mono blue, good against green aggro. It's good against red. It's good against burn, red aggro, black aggro, any color aggro deck. Eating a creature and also gaining 3 life, it's just so relevant. It doesn't look like it's that powerful, but it really, really is good at stabilizing. And then Scarab God is good when you don't have a lot on the board. If you have just like maybe a Thassa that's not really doing anything, or like an extra Fires or Enigmatic or something, sacrificing it for a Scarab God is so good because you can just build an army with just Scarab God. It's really good against any deck that has creatures, any like creature deck that has like good creatures you can take. You can also take all your own creatures, generate value when you exile them with Scarab God. Remember that you can actually place a stop during your upkeep and exile a creature. Like, so a common play pattern will be 5 mana, play Fires, play Scarab God or something like that. Or maybe you spent your mana, maybe you had Fires in play already, you put Yorion in your hand and you went like Omen of the Sea, Scarab God. You're tapped out with your mana. You place a pause during your upkeep, and then in response to your own trigger, you can exile a creature, and then you get its effect, and then it also triggers for its ability. So you get an extra life. You get an extra life ping on your opponent. You get an extra scry. This card is so strong. It's just resistant to removal. It makes more extra bodies. It filters your draws. This card does so much for 5 mana. It is crazy that this card is only 5 mana. This card is really, really strong. And then at the top end, you have Leyline Binding, Agent of Treachery, and Titan of Industry. Leyline Binding is just one of the best removal spells in the format. You can play this as early as turn 2. You can go like turn 1, Spara's Headquarters, turn 2, tapped Blood Crypt, and then you can Leyline Binding something of your opponent's on this as soon as the second turn. It's nuts. And then turn 4, if you have Leyline Binding in play, you just sacrifice it and get one of these. You just literally sacrifice and get Agent of Treachery or Titan of Industry, and you're just dominating the game. Like if your opponent has a really good board state, great. You just make 2 bodies and like destroy something of theirs or gain some life. It's just nuts. Or if they have a really, really problematic permanent that Titan can't deal with, just steal it. Just steal the permanent. Maybe whatever you popped with Leyline Binding was really good. Sack Leyline Binding, they get their permanent back, and then you steal it with Agent of Treachery. Like... And then you can just do degenerate stuff like blink Agent of Treachery with Yorion or with Thassa. You can blink Titan with Thassa. Thassa is really also cool because it works with all the lower end stuff the same way that Serra Paragon does. Serra Paragon obviously lets you recast your smaller stuff, but Thassa is also really good. It blinks all your lower end stuff, but also blinks your upper end stuff. So it's better with stuff that's currently in play. The other one's obviously better with stuff in your graveyard. Thassa also is really nice because it doesn't care about graveyard disruption, whereas Serra Paragon cares about graveyard disruption. If you like if you're playing in a matchup where you side and rest in peace, your Thassa doesn't care about that. You don't care about exiling your own graveyard. That's what you're doing at the top end. And then you have the lands. The mana base is kind of a mess in this deck. I'm not going to really get into it. The only things I'll tell you are the least important color typically is black. There's 9 cards that require black, and a lot of them you're going to be casting. You're either going to be tutoring up or casting with the Fires of Invention. That being said, though, black is very important against the aggressive decks because of Trial of Ambition in this deck in particular. You can play 4 color versions that run Omen of the Forge and then cut all the other black cards out of the deck too. And then cut Blood Mage, which isn't like the most important card. You can cut Oath of Kaya, Gloom Shrieker, and Siege Rhino and Scarab God. I think a lot of these cards are really strong. Like I wouldn't want to play without Scarab God or Siege Rhino or Gloom Shrieker. Like I think these cards are really, really important. I think Trial is worth playing the black mana for. Trial in so many situations is just a lot better than Omen of the Forge. There's like a reasonable amount of creatures that have 3 or more toughness that I think it's worth keeping Trial. That being said, Omen of the Forge and no black in the deck does loosen up your mana a lot. It also makes your mana less painful. You can play some of the pathway lands and chop some of the shock lands and some of the lands. You can play like Fabled Passage. You get to play Omnath. You get to play some other cool stuff in the 4-color deck. There's actually a list that one of the guys in Worlds submitted that's playing red instead of black that you could experiment with. That's up to you. You can do what you want to do. I'm just showing you kind of what the standard is for this deck. There's a lot of Tri-lands. Tri-lands are good early and late. They're really, really good turn 1 because obviously they make all 3 colors of mana. But then later in the game, especially when you have fires out, you can cycle them into real cards, which is really nice. So later in the game, they're not dead draws, and they work really well with the check lands. There's a lot of pain in this mana base. You can see we're running a lot of shock lands. We have like 10 shock lands or something, but they are important. It's important to play the shocks because you need the different colors of mana, and you need untapped sources in the deck, and you can't just play check lands, particularly because you're also playing Leyline Binding, and Leyline Binding cares about land types, and you don't want to play only all tapped lands. So you don't want to play just a bunch of triomes. You want to play a mix of triomes, shocks, and checks. And then you play the basics because of stuff like Yarshan. We'll get to this in a little bit. Yarshan, you play against Field of the Dead. You want basics for Assassin's Trophy, which is played in this format. Beseiju, Who Endures. You can experiment with different numbers of things. I actually haven't experimented with the mana much. This is probably not optimal. I just haven't done enough research to know for sure what is optimal. Let's take a peek at the sideboard. 2 copies of Rest in Peace, 2 copies of Fry, 3 Mystical Dispute, 2 Destiny Spinner, 2 Temporary Lockdown, and then a bunch of one-ofs, which are more tutor targets for your Incarnation, Yarshan, Baneslayer, and Coma. Other people play some other things on the sideboard. There's a lot of different things you can play. Nimble Larcenist, which is good against Control and Grindier decks. I do wish it said Enchantment, because then it'd be good in the Mirror too, but it's not really meant for the Mirror. You could play another copy of Temporary Lockdown. I mean, you're playing 5 colors, so you could freaking play Thoughtseize if you wanted to in the sideboard. You can play kind of anything in the sideboard. This is pretty standard what I'm playing in the sideboard here. Rest in Peace is really good against the most popular deck in the format. One of the most popular is Anvil Sacrifice, which has like the cat combo, and Rest in Peace is really good against the cat combo type decks. Exiles the cat and Croxa and all sorts of other stuff. It's also relevant against the Greasefang decks because they can't bring back Parhelion. Fry, it's very, very good against the mono blue Spirits deck, which a lot of people play right now, especially in like the plat and diamond ranking. I've noticed a lot of people play mono blue Spirits, and the fact that you can have an uncounterable removal spell is really nice. But it also deals with stuff from like Is It Prowess, Balmor, Sprite Dragon, Azorius Humans, like mono white humans, Selesnya Soldiers. Mystical Dispute is an awesome card against any blue deck. I board these in against the Enigmatic Mirror because it counters the namesake Enigmatic Incarnation. It also counters Yorion, Omen of the Sea. I mean, anything blue you see here, it can counter. You can copy fires, counter fires, and mention it's just best against blue stuff, obviously. It's also good against blue-white control. I see blue-white control quite a bit at my rating level. Good against mono blue Spirits, again. Pretty obvious when to sideboard this card in. If they're playing blue in their deck, it's probably good. Temporary Lockdown is good against Cat Oven also, because it pops basically all their relevant stuff except for Mayhem Devil. Blows up their Witches Ovens and all their random artifacts they have. Elves, humans, just anything that runs a lot of like 1 and 2 ofs, burn, all sorts of like random stuff that's playing like anything that's playing like weird permanent types for like have like a heavy low curve artifact deck. It's actually sweet because it also exiles your own 2-drops. So when it gets removed eventually, or you blink it or something, your things come back and they generate value for you again, which is sweet. For example, if you exile 2 of your opponent's creatures and like 2 of their artifacts or something, but then you exile like your own Trial of Ambition and Urban Utopia. If you ever lose your lockdown and they get their stuff back, they have to like sack a creature, you draw a card, like you get some value out of it dying too, which is kind of funny. Destiny Spinner doesn't look like it does that much, but this is one of the most diverse cards in the sideboard. I think this card is so good in so many matchups. The fact that this card is 2 mana is just so great. So there's so much to unpackage in this card. This card is a 2 mana 2/3 enchantment creature. So right off the bat, this is a creature that you can sacrifice it to Enigmatic Incarnation, and then one of the most relevant parts of it is that creature and enchantment spells you control can't be countered. So if this was just a 2-mana 2/3 creature and enchantment spells you control can't be countered, that would be perfect. That would be exactly what you want. This. If you resolve this, like mono blue spirits, I keep using that example, but it's an important one. They just can't counter anything of yours for the rest of the game. Your entire deck is creatures and enchantments. That is all your deck is. It's also pretty strong against blue-white control. Blue-white control has more ways to deal with it, to remove it, right? They have stuff like Portable Hole, March Otherworldly Light, Planeswalkers that can clean it up. For the most part, this card is just really, really strong against any blue deck. It's also good against the aggressive decks because what you can do is you can sideboard out like an Urban Utopia or like another clunky 2-drop or a bigger card you don't need and just replace them with 2-mana 2/3s. And a 2-mana 2/3 is a really good blocker to sit in front of an elf beating you down or a 2/2 body that's bashing you in like from humans. It's a blocker for days. Mono red deck. It's really good against is just being a blocker. Also, this just has the random bonus ability of being able to animate your lands in the late game, which is also really good with Fire's Convention. So when you have fires and you have nothing to spend, you have all this mana every turn, you can just spend 4 mana and make like a XX elemental with trample. Destiny Spinner is such a great card. Yarshan's good against Cat Oven also. Great card to tutor up by sacrificing a Fable or something with your Incarnation. Not all decks play this card, but I think it's a really good card. It's also decent against Liliana decks because it gives you discard fodder. Like a play pattern can be play your Enigmatic and then sacrifice like your Gloomshrieker or your Fable, 3-mana Oath of Kaya, get Yarshan, and then you get 2 lands that you can put in your hand that you can discard to Liliana. So it's good in those mid-range matchups. A 4/4 body's also not irrelevant to those mid-range matchups either. A 4/4 can trade with your opponent's Graveyard Trespasser. It blocks Bone Crusher Giant. This thing just has so much text on it. This card is really, really good. It's better than it looks. Baneslayer Angel has been sweet. A lot of people were running a different card in the 5-mana slot. A lot of lists don't run this card. I started running this card because I saw it in the sideboard of blue-white control decks, and I was like, why don't we just run this card in our deck? Like, it's so good at stabilizing against, like, it's super good to tutor up against like the mono blue deck because it's a flyer and it blocks and gains you life. It's good against any aggressive card, and you can play it against like the mid-range decks too. If you're like a dead card, you can bring this in against some more mid-range strategies also. Anything that's trying to beat you down, this card is awesome. It just puts a big body in play. First strike lifelink is like so important, and the fact that it can block flyers, this card is just sweet. Very, very solid on rate. It's also one of my favorite Magic cards too, but I'm not being biased. I think Baneslayer is actually really good in this deck in the sideboard. Massacre Girl, that's interesting. It's a little bit hard to cast, but if you tutor it, it's really good. Oh, Yarok. I don't know if how good Yarok is. I don't know if this is like a win more card. Last card in the sideboard is gonna be Homa. I used to play this in Niv Mizzet Reborn in Pioneer. This card is sweet. It is unbelievably good against control. It is awesome against control, particularly to sandbag for when they farewell you, because you can rebuild a board state so fast with this thing. One turn after playing this, 1 turn cycle, you already have 3 bodies in play. It can give itself indestructible, so it survives sweepers. Yeah, it's just a really strong card. This card's great. Can't be countered. You make serpents every turn, including your opponent's turns. Coma is also good when you don't want something like Agent of Treachery or Titan. Like against some matchups, Agent of Treachery isn't really that good, or Titan, but you want to have enough tutors for hitting off Leyline Binding. Sometimes you will just bring in Coma and substitute out like Agent of Treachery for Coma. Some matchups Agent isn't good enough because none of their permanents are really that strong. Coma is just a better option to play in those situations. I don't think I can think of any offhand. It's also just really good against any deck where you just want to have multiple bodies, similar to Titan, because Titan and like Tolsimir, because these guys generate multiple bodies. Like this is just another creature that generates multiple bodies. Same reason why Callous Blood Mage is good. So that's every card in the deck and the sideboard. I mean, I can give you guys some quick pro tips for anyone who already knows how this deck works but wants to just play it at a bit of a higher level. Some things that I've learned, a couple pointers, just basic play patterns that you'll get with this deck a lot. When you're doing your mulligans, you want to try to make sure you have as many colors as possible to play all the spells that you currently have in your hand. So typically, as long as you have the right mana to play what spells you've been given, that's usually pretty good. You always typically want to have green too. Green is a very important color to have in this deck. It matters a lot. If you have a hand with fires, you obviously if you have a red mana, that hand is almost certainly going to be good enough, even if you're missing a color or two of other mana, because once you cast the fires, you can cast all your spells anyway. If you have something like Leyline Binding, try to sequence your lands so you can play Leyline Binding as early as possible. So let's say you have Indatha Triumph and then like a Steam Vents. You can play Indatha Triumph on turn 1 tapped, and then you can play Steam Vents on turn 2 tapped, and then you could have a 1 mana Leyline Binding ready to go. Pretty obvious, right? What's not so obvious that took me a while to figure out was, let's say you have a Ketria Triome and a Godless Shrine. Now, typically you want to play Ketria Triome on turn 1, and then you want to play Godless Shrine on turn 2. But if you play Godless Shrine turn 2, you're going to have to shock it into play if you want to play Leyline Binding on turn 2, because even though it only costs 1, you need the white mana from Godless Shrine. What you then would want to do is you'd want to sequence it so you play the Godless Shrine tapped on turn 1, and then you play the Ketria Triumph on turn 2 tapped. So then your white mana is untapped on turn 2 and you don't have to pay the 2 life. So sometimes there's some weird counter-logical ways you play your lands in this deck in order to effectively cast Leyline Binding. Leyline Binding makes the sequencing of your lands very, very weird. If you have the option, make sure you try to play your lands in the way that gives you the most flexibility as possible. If you play Zagoth Triumph on turn 1, no matter what your untapped land is on turn 2, you now have the option to play Omen, Trial, or Urban Utopia on turn 2. Even if your untapped land is like a forest and you already have green mana, that gives you the option to play all 3 of these on turn 2. Same with if you have like the Bant one, like you have Spar's Headquarters, is flexible because it gives you the option to play Utopia, Omen, or Spirited Companion, or even potentially Leyline Binding on turn 2. So you want to think about what turn 1 land is going to maximize what you can play on turn 2. And sometimes you want to think about top decks, like Zayatora's Proving Ground on turn 1. I leave myself open for if I top deck like a Trial or Urban Utopia on turn 2, I can play it. So you want to think about your turn 2 play when you're playing your turn 1 land. That's really, really important in this deck. Typically, you want to have untapped mana for turn 2 and turn 4. If you don't have a turn 2 play, you don't need to have untapped mana for turn 2. Then you want to sequence it so you have untapped turn 3 and turn 4. But you always play a tap land on turn 1, obviously, because you don't have any turn 1 plays in this deck. Be aware that if you have Enigmatic Incarnation and you sacrifice to fetch at the end of your turn, if you Moonbless Cleric during your turn, like you naturally cast this and then you choose to Enigmatic, it will shuffle away the card that you put on the top of your deck with the Moonbless Cleric. So just keep that in mind because I've made that mistake before. Again, Skyclave Apparition cannot target anything mana value 4 or greater, and it cannot target tokens. Skyclave Apparition is also up to 1, so you don't have to target something with Skyclave, but you do have to target something with Deputy Detention. Deputy is a forced target. So even if you don't want to target something, you do have to with Deputy. It's kind of relevant with blinking something with Yorion. So if you blink things with Yorion, the way the things enter back into play is, I think usually the Skyclave Apparition goes in the stack first, and then the Deputy goes in the stack second, so the Deputy will resolve first. And if your opponent has only one legal target that both of them can target, then the Deputy will be taking away that permanent instead of the Skyclave. Usually if you have the option, Skyclave it's always better to remove something with a Skyclave than a Deputy. Also important, if you have the option, again, always use Skyclave if you have the option to Skyclave something. It's better to Skyclave something than Deputy, because when Skyclave leaves, they just get a token to replace it. And then later down the line, you could actually just exile that token with like something like Deputy Detention. Deputy Detention, again, is amazing at sweeping up tokens. Oh, another benefit about Deputy is Deputy can clean up multiple permanents at once. So if your opponent has 2 Goblin Shaman tokens from Fables, then you can clean up both of them at the same time. Or 2 Reflections of Kiki Jiki. Or if 2 of anything. If they have 2 of anything, it's really good at sweeping up multiple copies. Gloomshrieker gets exiled if it were to die, but it does not get exiled if you blink it. So blinking Gloomshrieker with something like Yorion is really sweet, but Gloomshrieker, yes. Gloomshrieker you cannot return from your graveyard. Renegade Rallier can bring back lands from your graveyard also, which is sweet. So Renegade Rallier can actually ramp you, which I don't often do. I usually always would rather draw a card with like Omen or Urban Utopia, but being able to ramp is an option you can choose to do if you'd like to. Again, the card Fires of Invention is super duper flexible. This card is great because you can cast 2 spells the turn you cast it, and you can also activate things with the mana you have open. So make sure you use as much of your mana as possible when you have Fires. Cast both of your spells, but also use the mana to do stuff like put Yorion in your hand, activate the Scarab God, Activate Omen of the Sea. Activate Thassa. You could activate Destiny Spinner, like if you're playing sideboarded games, so on and so forth. What's also cool with Fires is if on turn 3 you didn't have a play and you brought Yori into your hand, or let's say even if you don't have Yori in your hand, let's say you go turn 4 Fires and then you play a spell. Turn 5, you cast 2 more spells, and then you spend your mana and you put Yorion in your hand, which is a pretty common play pattern after a turn 4 Fires of Invention. What you'll often do on turn 6, play a spell with your 6, you can play a spell for free, play like a 2 or 3 drop, then cast Yorion and blink your Fires of Invention along with all your other stuff. And then since Fires of Invention is not in play anymore, you can spend your other 6 mana on spells and things. So Yorion is really, really, really strong with Fires of Invention. The interaction with these 2 cards is really powerful. Yeah, I mean, don't forget you can blink Titan, you can blink Agent with like the Fable flip. So Fable flip is really good. Reflection of Kiki-Jiki is really good with these 2. Glasspool Mimic can always copy your best creature, but it can be played as a land, which you'll often do a lot of the times if you naturally draw this card. So don't be afraid to play it as a land if you need the land, especially play it early, like turn 1 or 2. The cards I'm most frequently sideboarding out. So against like aggressive matchups, I'll shave like a 7-drop. I'll shave the Scarab God against the aggro matchups. Thassa, I'll shave a copy of Renegade Rallier, and I want more lower end stuff against the grindier matchups. Sometimes I will shave like Knight of Autumn if the artifact enchantment ability part of it isn't relevant. I'll shave some removal like Trial or Oath of Kaya. In the grindier matchup, I'll shave Siege Rhino and Tolsimir if they don't have a lot of creatures that I'm trying to interact with, you know. That's it. I mean, that's the deck. The deck is really strong. It's really powerful. You can build it a lot of different ways. If you're watching this video on YouTube, I will link some more resources below so you can see other options you can play this deck with. I will share the version that's being played in the World Championships. I'll also share the most recent version on Goldfish, and then I'll share my version, which I'm probably actually going to change tonight. I'm going to make some more adjustments, but that's the deck. That's it. That's like what we're playing today. We're going to get going and play some games.